good to go.
Okay, good, great. Okay, so welcome to the CSS seminar for Friday, the last Friday of September. And I guess Andrew, you did one last week, right?
Yes.
And I've been meaning to watch it all week. I assume it's on YouTube, and I haven't gotten around to it.
It's really not worth it.
I'm sure that's false, but in the context of rehearsing other past seminars, let me just mention that in last spring I gave a seminar about a broad overview of kind of the use of agent-based computing in the social sciences generally and economics in particular, on saying at that time that we were on the verge of producing a broad overview paper. Mm-hmm. So that paper is now done. There's a 50-page paper floating around with like 700 references that's meant to be kind of a summary of in particular how agents are used in economics and finance. If anybody wants to have a draft copy of that, we are not at the stage of submitting it for final publication for another couple months yet. So that's time for edits. So if anybody wants to see the result of me taking all of your good comments from the last talk I gave and integrating them, etc., I'm happy to share that. Okay, so with that as background, let me just say that so this is a talk about firm ages, lifetimes, and you're going to basically see that so I'm going to essentially just spend most of the time showing you guys data about U.S. firms and their ages and some of the properties of the firms. The way it connects to computational models is simply to say that in essence, everything I'm going to show you today is a target for what we'd like to have a computational model hit if in fact we're going to build models of firm dynamics, for example. And the short version of it is, which some of you have seen, almost all of you have seen me present models of firm dynamics before, is that we have now trained an agent-based model to get very close to the kind of data I'm going to show you here. Okay, so in essence, what we really want to talk about is that the population of American firms is very dynamic, and we're going to basically try to figure out what is a model, what is a minimal model that reproduces that. This talk is not primarily about the model, although that'd be a different talk. This talk talks primarily about what should the model hit. All right. Just by way of background, let me just say this: it is not common actually for economists to deal with firm ages. And so this is a quote from a well-known economist, kind of in the pre-mathematical era, Schumpeter, basically saying that it'd be great to have. This is in his book about business cycles. He basically says it'd be great to have more data about firm ages. So kind of for someone like Schumpeter, it's kind of implicit that the world is composed of the private sector. The capitalist economy is composed of a finite number of firms that are in a constant state of turmoil and turnover. That is not actually the way that modern, the way that modern mathematical economics came to it with a different idea. And that, in essence, you say, if the economy at this time today, is kind of at a snapshot, and we have some set of firms. Let's just think about those firms. But over time, we're going to have a very, kind of evolving and changing set of firms. And of course, Schumpeter was one of the early evolutionary economists, so he had this longer-term view. So we're going to look at now, what the data are about, and tell us about these broad categories. Which when Schumpeter wrote this, he had no idea what these data were going to say. Okay, the further motivation. I wrote motivation 1 here. A further motivation is I've titled this slide probably badly, but I titled it "History of basically a wrong idea." Because here's the history. Here's how this goes. So back in the 80s, back at the birth of the Reagan era, a journalist. Do I have his name here or not? No, I don't. Oh yeah, a journalist named David Birch. Simply, he asked the question. He said, we have these kind of, this was back in the early 80s, kind of the emergence of kind of the Rust Belt idea, the Rust Belt industries, and so Birch said, okay, well, who is it that's actually creating jobs in America? And the answer that he got by running a simple regression was he basically showed that if you asked how many jobs are created as a function of how big the firms are, a simple regression tells you that basically almost all the jobs are created by small firms. And the big firms are basically always shedding jobs, which of course they can't always be true in the sense that if big firms always shed jobs, there wouldn't be big firms anymore, right? So there's also there's a background process of the fact that small firms are growing to big firms, but there's some kind of senescence involved, right? As a firm ages, or I don't use the word age yet, because that's going to be a reserved word for later. But as a firm gets bigger and becomes more mature, it somehow starts becoming much less creative, much less generative of jobs. So this is what Birch claimed anyway. Okay. Now this became quickly. It seemed to be kind of it was all part and parcel for the era. Kind of small is better, and let's get government out of everything, and we'll have the Small Business Administration will husband make sure that there are not regulations passed that influence small businesses, et cetera. And so this was kind of, this has been, I would almost call it the ideology of kind of, for example, even a journal called Small Business Economics. Zoltan Ox is a journalist professor is watching us. Zoltan edits the journal called Small Business Economics. Small businesses are very important, but it turns out that there's this wicked high correlation between between size and age. There's lots of small firms are young. I'm going to talk more about that in a second, and lots of big firms are old. So it turns out that when you just run a regression conditional on smallness and size, you possibly compounding it, in essence, conflating it with age. And so only recently did researchers, and this includes people at the University of Maryland, like John Haltenwang and other people, when you control for age, and you rerun the Birch regressions, you find that size plays little role at all. That almost all the action is happening because of age of the firm, not size. So you say, well, why do we have a small business administration? Maybe we should have a young business administration. that'd be one or maybe some of you saw with all the stuff about tax. I'm not going to get into taxes today, but a lot of stuff about taxes in the news now. There was an editorial in the Wall Street Journal on Monday or earlier this week about something like, give 99.9% of firms a tax break. Well, most firms in America are small, so 99.9% of firms are small. Thus, you give most firms a tax break by simply giving small firms a tax break. But small may not be the issue. I mean, think about it, there are lots of things like, there are lots of small firms that are not growing at all, restaurants, that kind of stuff, right? They have no capacity to grow, say, but there are there are young firms that could grow. Okay, so the current thinking today is that we have high job creation by young firms, not necessarily small firms. And just to kind of separate young and small out, I have this kind of notional picture next. And the notional picture is that, look, most young firms are small, but most small firms are not young. All right, so that's one way to think about this. There's a big population of small firms. There's a couple. These are the ones that entered in the last year or two. It's a relatively small population. So once again, just say it again. Most young firms are small, but and we'll be more precise about that. But most small firms are not young, and that's gonna that's. So the thrust of maybe now the further motivation for this talk is to say, historically, economists have not really cared about the ages of firms. So most theoretical models don't have anything about firm age. I'm advocating basically that we do include that, mostly because once again, when you condition on job creation on things like age, you get the age matters more than the size. Okay. So Don, just some quick background on. So just to calibrate, I'm going to show you guys now a whole bunch of data. And you just have to calibrate. Some of you have seen these kinds of things before. This is it. So all the plots I'm showing you next are from our book, and some of them are in the process of being reworked. There are 150 figures in the book. The only reason why the book is not out yet is because Omar and I can't get 150 figures rearranged into a form that's usable. We can't produce high quality EPS images at a fast enough pace. We're doing about 3 or 4 or 5 a day, and we got a bunch more to go. So, okay, the blue line refers to how many firms there are in America. Notice over the last 30 years, roughly 25, 30 years, that's been relatively smooth. And then the workers in red, these kind of come up in lockstep. They get linked up. There's another figure in the book which basically shows now if you compute the average firm size. Average firm size is about 20 in America. So this is 120 million workers arranged in 6 million firms, somewhere almost 6 million firms. So right around 20. Now there is a little dip here for the crisis. I'm going to show you additional data on that as we go forward. But first approximation. By the way, you might think that if we hadn't had the crisis, maybe there would have been some kind of growth up here. Maybe it would have been up to a higher level. So in some sense, the fact that the data are not changing very much is a consequence of the fact that we had a bit of a crisis. We had a decade-long crisis, in fact, and we have some more data additional. This is only going through 2013, and we now have up through 15. So. Okay, so this is just the background on workers and firms. Okay, so now next I want to show you. So with 6 million firms, roughly 6 million firms in America. This is 6 million firms with employees. There are another 24 or 25 million firms with no employees. I'm not going to talk about them today at all. Okay, so just because those things are more volatile than what I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you something that's very volatile already, but I'm going to show you something those are even more volatile because that's just like the Kirk's Consulting Company or the Kennedy Consulting Operation is a firm with no employees, presumably. If you fill out Schedule C on your taxes, you become a firm in the eyes of the IRS. Okay, so out of the 6 million firms, there's a bunch of turnover. How much turnover? Well, here's how many firms enter every year over the last 25 years. Notice I'm going to argue that essentially it's relatively flat here. You know, it's kind of a typical number. There have been some little epochs of time. Now this was the kind of Reagan recession here. There was another downturn here. The NASDAQ bubble burst. Here's the financial crisis really throwing things off. But look, to a first approximation, we have on the order of 500,000 firms, annual new firms with employees. Okay, so 500,000 firms, a year divided by 12, you're talking like 40,000 firms a month or something like that coming into existence. Okay, so 40,000 firms a month, divide by 20 working days a month. So you're talking about something like 2,000 firms a day in America come into existence. So every day of the week, 2,000 new EVs. They tend to be okay. Now there's this blip here. Recent data are that a little bit of that's upticking back to something looking more normal, but what's the nature of these? These are all young firms, right? These are basically these are all age 0 firms, right? They come into the economy every year. Although I'm going to say more about that. Right, this is obviously these firms came in 2005, so now in 2006 they're age 1. In 2007 they're age 2. So basically we're showing kind of these are the entrants that then progressively age. They're going to progressively drop out as they do better or worse. It is not the case that all new firms are very small. So this is showing that now we're going to report now on a power law where we are in the center of social complexity here. So it's requisite to show at least one power law in every talk, right? And so we have this is now the.
Are all the data points right on that curve?
So and we're over several decades of size, not as many as we have. For example, you guys remember that for firm sizes in the whole economy has a power law which slope about -1. But it goes up to 10 to the 6. The biggest firm in America is with 1 million firms. Here, over 3 decades, or 3.5 decades of size, we get this power law associated. So there are some entrants that are really come into the economy at size 100 or size 1,000. Who are these big entrants here? Well, these are typically going to be, to be honest, these are going to be things that these are firms that have either big corporations that have spun out a division and they get a new tax ID number. So they've actually privatized a division, or they've made it a completely separate entity. Or it could also be, sometimes when firms go through bankruptcy, they would then get a new tax ID number. These are basically these are administratively, what it means is, these are firms that have a new tax ID number, okay? So, but the main thing to say is that these are not all just, although it turns out most of them, what's back to the Wall Street Journal editorial, 99.9% of firms are very small, of entrants are very small, but a few are not.
If a new tax number qualifies them, does that mean some mergers would be in there too?
Mergers typically keep the number of the dominant firm.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, exits. Exits show kind of a similar picture, just kind of inverse to entrance. We have on the order of 400,000 here entrances or exits. Sorry, where exits are going to be a little bit higher there during the crisis years, coming back to normal. For the whole thing to be balanced, you want to have the same number of inflow and outflow. So this is we have on the order of a stationary distribution of number of firms. We have on the order. This is just a census data. Okay. Now we could talk about things like what is the size distribution of the exits, but we don't need to talk about size anymore. We really want to focus on ages, and we also could talk about. It made no sense to talk about the age distribution of the entrants because they're all age 0, age 1, however you want to count. It does make sense to talk about the age distribution of the exiting firms, but that's really just the lifetimes. And I'm going to show you lifetimes later. Okay, so just keep in mind that we tend to do age distribution, size distribution of the exiting firms, but that's going to come later. Okay, so the main thrust of this talk now is going to be what is the age distribution of American firms? There's some firms that are old, some are young. What is and then what is the lifetime distribution of American firms? Those are not the same thing, right? One is going to be there are firms that are alive at a certain age, and then the different one is when do the firms die and what's that distribution? Okay, so it turns out from one we can compute the other under certain assumptions. First thing to say about these data, everything that we do with firms is using these beautifully curated or administratively complete data from census that are roughly gleaned from IRS, and they have hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of menus in them. People are going out and getting data and collecting and assembling, etc. So we don't do anything with the data. We take the data as given. And one of the caveats in this world is that there are no data before 1975. Okay, so we're essentially dealing with censored data. All right, Now, depending on how you plot it, and census like to plot it in the following way, they would plot. They would do things like they would plot it this way and say, okay, if you look at the age, I'm going to show you a plot which is not this way, so I'm going to apologize ahead of time. If you look at what is how many firms there are that were founded if this was the founding year, we have no data before 1975, so you would say it's left censored, right? Everything over here is censored. What I'm going to show you are right censored data in the sense that I'm going to plot not the year they were founded, I'm going to plot the age of the firm, okay? They're just inverting the x's.
Why are they censored?
So it turns out that the technical reason is that the IRS created that kind of. Here's the 1 minute version of it.
By the way, some of the guys from the IRS might be watching.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay. So and they can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm happy to have the questions. the way I'm told is that tax returns are mostly processed by hand up until the 70s, and then you have large-scale computers and mainframes and card decks, et cetera. And then what was created conceptually in the 70s was a so-called business master file, which ostensibly, from the title of it, you think it would have the data about every single firm in America. But the way I'm told, the way that actually worked was, in different IRS zones of the country, they had separate files on the different firms that were regionally based there. So even though there was conceptually a business master file, the business master file was not on one machine until the year 2000 or 2001, 2000 I guess, late 2000, they finally got the 1997 data into one master file, so one giant file. Before that, they'd always been just on different files all around the country, and before 75, it was not even computational, it was not digital, it was just processed by hand. So that's the origin why we only have the data from 75 forward. Now, I believe that there actually are some, there are some sample data, or the IRS has long provided a so-called public use sample of both individual taxpayers and business taxpayers at something on the order of the 1/10 of 1% level. So when you think about 6 million firms, you're talking about 1/10 of 1% would be 6,000 firms would be a public use sample. That my understanding goes farther back, but we don't use those data since it's obviously very porous. You're missing gigantic. You're missing 99.9% of the firms. Okay, so what I'm going to show you next is the age distribution in the U.S. for let's pick a year, and let's say I'll show you any year 2002, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 up to the financial crisis. Okay, and it turns out, and here's the kind of the first take-home message, is that it doesn't matter which year I show you, those data are all the same. So this is a superimposition of 7 different lines, right? 2002 included, 2008 included, of the age distribution in the U.S. of firms, where we have, notice we have somewhat different truncation years. This is going back so in 2002, if the data go back only to 75, we're only going to have 27 years worth of data, so I have nothing over the 27, so that one is actually the one for 2002, okay. Superimpose these, they basically fall out under the same thing, so that we'd call these data are stationary, in the sense that the distribution is not changing over time. I mean, it's wiggling, wobbling, and it's doing a little stuff out here, but this is also a little bit, these are also the oldest data. They're probably crummier data because you just bring the data online, digital. So the main thing to say is that, but over here it's very smooth. Okay. Now, a little hard to see it, but notice I'm in log coordinates here, right? So half of 0.1 would be 0.5. 0.5 is way up here. This is log. Okay. If that was a straight line in log coordinates, we'd have an exponential distribution. Everybody buy that, right? And obviously hopefully your eyeball picks up the fact that it's not exactly linear. Right? Close. I mean, this part looks pretty linear, right? But this is not. And so one different way to say it is that this is going to conform now with, I'll assert that, we'll show more detail later. This is going to conform with economist intuition about small firms. You would say that small firms have a relatively higher failure rate. So when you think about failure rates, you're going to think about things like, well, how many, this is essentially a plot of, we have this many firms at age 5, we have fewer of age 6, we have fewer of age 7, so there's this basically attrition going on in this population, right, of firms. And the attrition is higher here, right? Think about the slope is basically the attrition rate, right? And the slope is higher here, so basically youngest firms have higher attrition. So it's not, we're getting to a little bit of a logical mess here, right? In the sense that David Birch says small firms create the most jobs. Now I'm asserting that playing a bunch of that, doing a bunch of that work. So it's really the young firms creating most of the jobs, but also the young firms are kind of creating jobs and then they're going out of business. So there's also a bunch of turnover among those very small firms, right? Okay, so I want to fit those data though. I want to fit them to something. I'm going to talk now about parametric estimators. So we're going to use we're going to try to parameterize things. It's such a smooth fit. I see no reason not to try that. I'll talk a little bit later about things that are non-parametric. Right? We use other techniques. By the way, in general, this whole idea of having things that fail, right? That some of these things don't make it to the next period. It's kind of monotone decreasing, right? So we're in the world of life cycle analysis, failure analysis, survival analysis. So there's a whole bunch of biostatistics on formalisms for this stuff. I'm not an expert on that area, but having played around with it, it seems it's a well-developed area. We can leverage those techniques. And I'm going to leverage them as we go, particularly when we go into the non-parametric part. But anyways, for this parametric part, so I want to fit a function to this. That's it's kind of exponential in this tail, but this part is not. Okay. By the way, let me also mention a footnote. Remember the work on sizes. Just go back to sizes. So one of the ways to get a paper published in high visibility areas to show the conventional wisdom is wrong. My paper on sizes really just said that when you have all the data, you show that you get this very skewed distribution as opposed to something which was not so skewed if you look at only for example, the publicly traded firms. It is the case. There's a recent paper from people at Santa Fe about what is this for the publicly traded firms. They get, guess what, an exponential distributions. They get the wrong answer because they have a very limited sample of firms. The public firms are about 10,000 firms, so there's a very limited. Now here we're putting in all the firms. And think about this. The public firms are not ones that are forming and dying immediately, right? Once the firm does an IPO, it's going to be around for a little while at least. And so. When you think about having a sample of only the CompuStat firms, or say the Fortune 1000, you're going to really be missing all the action on here. This was a lot of stuff going on.
So this is the hazard function.
No, this is just the age distribution.
Just the distribution.
We're going to get the hazard function.
So so what you're saying is the fact that the small firms are coming into the economy, and then some of them, maybe the majority of them, are leaving immediately.
Not majority, but
a sizable,
fraction.
And it seems like an accumulating amount.
Yeah, so this is not cumulative. This is basically a mass function, right? This is the age mass function, right?
So what you have is exponential decay starting at about age 5. So the hazard function at that point is pretty much constant. But then it's higher for the very newer firms because there's a lot of infant mortality.
And we're going to see too, and even your eyeball can be deceptive because we're working in logs here and things are complicated. So your intuition is more or less right in first order, Doug, and it's kind of off at second order. But yeah. Okay, so we're going to basically fit, and some of you guys probably know this from for taking a stat class somewhere, that one functional form that embeds the exponential, embeds in the sense that we can basically estimate parameters which it could in fact yield an exponential if that was a good fit, is the WEIBULL distribution. Okay. So here's just a quick background on the WEIBULL. So basically, if we were to write the cumulative distribution function of the WEIBULL and then look at the complement of that, that would be this theta sub c. I've written it as a function of age. Okay, it has that functional form. Now, if you plot the log of this thing, log of the cumulative distribution function versus that, you're going to get something that looks it's not quite linear. But notice this exponent, but the exponent q, if q was 1, you would get an exponential. So if q was 1, then you'd have basically a plot of this thing versus a linear would give you a straight line. That's the sense in which we're plotting log of something. We should have got a straight line if it was. But now we have this funny transformation. We got to get rid of that exponent. So let's actually log it again. Now you can't log this number is potentially negative, so you got to negate that. Log it into the double log thing, and now so a plot of double log of this thing versus log of that, versus log of age. This is a measure of how many firms there are, right? Cumulative versus log of age, and this is just some constant. Though P and Q are numbers here. If Q comes out to be near 1, then we have an exponential. If Q is not 1, then we have something else. And notice that we're going to do this weird plot. If this thing is a straight line, we're going to have a WEIBULL. If it's not a straight line, we don't. Okay? Everybody buy that? Everybody okay? Mm-hmm. So here's the graphical the graphical results. That's a pretty straight line. All right, so we have almost exactly a WEIBULL distribution. Q ends up being about 0.85. So it's not terribly non-exponential, but it's not exponential. Now that's going to matter a lot, it turns out. So Q being 0.85 means that you basically have in essence, a higher, we're going to get into it in a minute, but we're going to have a higher failure rate, higher hazard rate for the small firms, and a smaller one for the smaller one for the older firms. Did I say that right? Smaller has a rate for the young firms. Bigger has a rate for the older firms.
Bigger hazard rate for the young firms.
Right.
Smaller
Hazard rate for the older firms. Exactly right. That's right there. Okay. And this is plot's not labeled. This is age here. Well, this is actually this is the transform. Yeah, so we're basically right. This is log of age, and this is just that doubly log transform thing, which is has no natural interpretation. Okay, so we're gonna explore this thing. We're gonna go into details on it. Before we do, though, there is an interesting rub provided by the financial crisis. By the way, I typically call it the financial crisis, but we just had this big conference down at the Treasury last week, where all the financial guys were calling it the Great Recession, GR, Great Recession. I don't know what they were doing. What I'm going to show you next, I'm going to show you what is the age distribution of firms in America from 2009 to present. All right, and once again, I'm going to superimpose those plots. But now we're going to get something messier. I'm going to explain what it is. So here it is. This is age distribution for the this is up to 2014. The financial crisis happened in 2008, fall of 8. So 9 has an effect. So kind of like 5 years back, where things were happening. So the young firms, these are firms that experienced financial crisis. These are firms that survived the financial crisis. Everybody got that? Mm. Now, what you basically see here, and it's a little bit tricky to. I've colored these things Roy G. Biv. Okay, so red are the ones from 2009, and then 2010, 11, 12 go orange. Orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, or whatever that is. All right. So notice what happens in 2009. Well, not much effect in 2009. There's a little bit of a divot here, and basically what happened. Well, let me go back 2 slides to show. Notice what the vertical is here. It's about 10% of firms are small. It's a little bit less than 10%. But if you go back to what was the stationary thing back before, look at the stationary thing really is 10% of firms are new. Right? So think about it. 6 million firms on the order of 600,000, 500,000, so on the order of 10% are new. Here we're now post-crisis, people are not willing to take this. Entrepreneurs are scared, and you basically have only 8% of firms are the youngest ones.
It's not that entrepreneurs are scared, the financiers are.
The entrepreneurs try to get money and they get turned down, so they can't form the firms, right? Or your hotshot nephew from MIT says, I want to do a startup firm, and you're not willing to give them the money because they say it's a bad environment for the economy, or whatever it is. Right? There's some constraint.
No, he wants to borrow without a credit card. It's much harder to get a credit card now.
Fair enough.
That's how it's usually done.
So that's the red line. The red line dips, but now notice what happens is the next year we don't get back to having the higher firm formation rate. And in fact, now in year 1, there are in the orange line, there are too few age 1 firms because there were too few age 0 firms. Mm-hmm. And now the next one is yellow, red, orange, yellow. Now so the yellow one is now there are too few age 2 firms, mm-hmm. right? This is now 2011, and as you can see this defect, green, blue. You see the defect get propagated.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit like this kind of like it's like the. It's the snakes swallowing the rat, and you can see the rat kind of go all the way down to the snake's body over time. But the odd thing is that it is not. So the 2 things. So first of all, you see the defect propagating itself, and now by the way, people say you can't make predictions in social sciences. From this, I predict when somebody plots this damn thing in 2025, you're going to see a defect, right, sitting there. It's unavoidable.
It's kind of like the notch in a population distribution.
Exactly.
After a war, it's going to go all the way through.
There are too few men in the UK in 1920 after World War I. Exactly.
But it's interesting. It's got this curvilinear shape
to
it too.
Yeah.
So it's not a single spike.
It's more complicated.
Space.
Exactly. That's right, Joel. The whole firm formation process. That in our economy has been somehow basically fundamentally corrupted, whether it be for financial reasons or whatever, both in its magnitude and in its shape. Mm-hmm. Right, the shape is corrupted as well as the magnitude. These firms are there's not that much going. If you survive the financial crisis, you're okay, right? This is
So just hypothetical science fiction future because that's what we like. So when that defect gets to the 30-year mark.
Yeah.
There's a potential that instead of having a Fortune 500, which is powerful enough for the U.S. economy, it's very possible you may have such huge consolidation that you may end up with a single Walmart that owns the entire economy.
Something weird like that is possible.
Something like that.
And,
'Cause you don't have
if you can
enough
figure that out, you
firms
can probably
at the-
trade on it and make some money.
Or you get a resurgence in private capital markets replacing the credit card and home equity financing that has gone away and is
dried
coming
up.
back. And eventually you see a bulge, you're going to get a distribution of, and I think this is what you were anticipating
Yeah.
in your talk.
Yeah.
You're gonna get more younger firms as you go.
Well, so that's the
because
question,
it's not
that's
to
right.
the older firm.
So don't we have some artificial
Population.
caps on age and size too because of regulation, right? Anti-monopolistic practices and stuff like that?
So let's see, it's on.
Because we wanna keep competition in the markets.
So yeah, so what there is another, so there is so it turns out here's one way to answer your question. At least the age one is complicated. I don't know how to do age, but size. So with size, there are a bunch of regulations that impact size and things like by the way, it was claimed 6 or 8 years ago that Obamacare would have a big impact on size. I don't have that slide. I don't have the slide on the slide deck, but I do have it somewhere. The idea that firms that are below a certain size don't need to provide health care. Above a certain size, you have to. So it turns out that some guys at the IMF recently did this plot for Europe and they did for France, and what they found was that if for firm size, where you should get this beautifully straight line in log coordinates, what you find is for this, if you look at the size 10 firms, there are too many French firms that are size 9, 8, 7, and not enough of size 11, 12, 13, because there's a French law which says basically that if you reach size 10, you have a much more difficult time to fire somebody. Now, there's a further law in France, where there's this EU law, and EU law has a whole different set of labor standards that kick in at age 50, size 50. So guess what happens at size? There are too many firms in France that are size 46, 47, 48, and 49, not enough that are 51 through 55. So you see these abrupt breaks in the data. So it is possible to have those kind of breaks for size, where the regulations report size. Or with age is more complicated, right? Because age really has to do with why are firms failing? When do entrepreneurs decide to take the firm out of business? That kind of stuff, right? So, and then the inverse question: when do you found a firm? So, but notice there's some problem with founding firms. That's low. But anyways, but the main thing to say is that okay, look, we can still fit this data. Okay, this is relatively a small perturbation here. Where I'm anthropomorphizing and we're saying why we believe this is, not just interpretation of why this is. Probably zero-thread or right. Probably a lot of other stuff going on, like why it's happening. We don't really know. But let's say there is a paper by Haltwinger et al. At Maryland where they basically say, much like what Doug has suggested, they actually say that the fact that this crisis was driven by a housing bubble and that people lost equity in their homes means that a lot of entrepreneurs who would have as their house went up in value, they could basically get a loan and start a firm with the equity that was kind of on paper but not necessarily real. They didn't sell their house to. The fact that their house equity has dried up to a large extent. The number there is so the Dallas Fed estimated that the financial crisis cost U.S. homeowners somewhere between the numbers are quite approximate between $5 and $10 trillion of home equity value. So that's money that's not available for people to start up companies and so. Anyway, so that's a conventional interpretation. Yes, go.
That would also affect people's ability to pay for college.
Yep.
True, that's right. But you've seen since the financial crisis, you've seen basically where private colleges were raising their tuition at quite a rapid rate. That's now plateaued. And I saw the number recently that since 2013 or 14, the total number of, so even though some colleges have raised tuition still, the question is, are they actually getting any more? Are they raising any more money by doing that, or are they just having to give financial aid? And the answer is the total amount of tuition dollars paid by American parents has been basically flat for the last 5 or 6 years. They're not paying any more. You can raise tuition all you want, but you're not going to be able to get people to pay.
Well, student loans.
Well, that's some of that. But I'm just reporting the fact that we're kind of hit some revenue neutral point where you basically can't get more. Raising tuition rates, you don't get more tuition dollars. Okay, but we can still fit a WEIBULL to this, and we do this in the book. If you fit the WEIBULL to this, you get basically the same parameters. It's not quite as good a fit because of this crap up here. Okay, but it's the same idea. Okay, so what I want to do now move on to next are going to be things like hazard function things. But before that, let's just also do things like I want to further argue how stationary these things are. So let's just say what is the average firm age time series? Right? Okay, from these plots we have this truncation problem here, but because I've estimated the parameters of the thing. If you go along with the idea that I'm going to say that the firms out here are also WEIBULL, right? We're looking at a truncated WEIBULL, a censored WEIBULL, right? I'm only seeing in this case now up to about 35 years of data. So if in fact if the thing is WEIBULL out past there, it turns out the average firm age is about 15 years, and the median firm age is about 10. Okay, so you get typical story where it's a little bit skewed, so you're going to get the average is a little bit bigger than the median. And so we say, now, is this thing roughly stationary? So we can compute then what is the average age. So I guess yeah, so this is, I think I'm actually plotting, I've written average here. I believe this is actually the median, not the average. But now that I say that, I don't know. I'm going to show you a different plot, which has a different version of that anyways.
That looks more like a median than a mean.
Yeah, so what we've done is just standard deviation one up, one above and below. But no, so it's not changing very much. There is a bit of a tendency, right? It's pretty flat through here. There's a very small tendency after the financial crisis that you don't have as much turnover, so firm age is getting a little bit older. But it's a small effect. By the way, there have been a bunch of papers written about the dramatic change in entrepreneurship rates causing huge changes in the composition of American firms. Well, it's a very small change in terms of these averages and medians. Now I want to do two similar computations. I want to say how does size depend on age? How does age depend on size? So first thing, what is the average firm size conditional on age? So let's take all the age 10 firms, and what is the range of this now?
Now, for all of these things, you're talking about size in terms of number of full-time employees.
That's right, Doug. Exactly right. So it turns out if you did it by receipts, you would get the same qualitative structure with a different labeling of the axis.
And I'm just thinking one of the things ACA did do is that a number of companies went to subcontracting rather than grow number of employees because they wanted to stay under that ceiling.
That's a claim, and I even heard this guy Doug Holtz. He can talk about this one time, and I think that when you actually look for the data in that, you're talking about less than 1%. Even though it's real, it's very small. Okay, so what this plot is okay. So this just says if you pick a certain age group, certain set of firms of a certain age, and you ask how big are they, so you do get these interesting structures. That it is the case. It's causality here is complicated. There really is no causality. Right? It's not the case that older firms, just by growing older, you automatically grow bigger. That's not true. But it just happens to be the case, right? That firms that here's one way to think about it. Firms that have made it to this age tend to be bigger than firms that are younger. That's one way to think about it. Now this is the size in terms of number of employees. Now what I've written here, Florence median. The Florence median is now a weighted measure. So this would say things like let's take two firms that are age 50. Walmart is roughly age 50. Walmart was founded like 1960 or something. So age 50. So you take a giant firm like Walmart and take a small firm like Doug and Rob's Consulting Company. We don't have such a thing, but there could be. Okay. So now imagine we were both a age 50 firm. Imagine you had that. Now you in the conventional calculation, you're going to weight them each one. Now Walmart counts as one firm, and we count as one firm. So this thing says let's weight Walmart as 1,000,000 times more important because it's 1,000,000 times bigger. Okay. So the Florence median is basically what is the typical size of a firm weighted by number of workers, and what you basically get now is a much more. Now this is in logarithmic coordinates here, right? So you get a much bigger. You get a much bigger number, and just I should say for the whole economy, it turns out for the whole economy, the Florence median is 500, which what that means is half of American workers are working firms of size 500 and smaller, and half work in firms that are bigger than 500. Okay, so that's one way to think about it. Now, you're implicitly weighting. In that, you're weighting the big firms more than the small firms, right? So even though the Wall Street Journal editorial said, give 99.9% of firms a tax break by preferentially treating small firms as being differently in the tax code, half of American workers are working in firms that are fairly large by this measure. But the main thing to say is that no matter how you compute this kind of, what is the typical, what we really care about is what is typical size. What's a typical American firm by size? I think when you ask a congressman what's a typical firm in his or her district, he's going to tell you something more like this. He's going to say, well, there's a big metalworking plant down here, and there's one auto factory or something. He's not going to say these are very small firms, relatively speaking. So but the main thing to say is that to a first approximation, because this is logarithmic coordinates, this is not right. To a first approximation, size increases exponentially with age. Everybody okay with that? So you get older, you're going to become substantially bigger. Now this is going to have implications for some stuff we're going to do later. Because I want you to think about here. I'll put the bug in here so you can think about it for just a minute before we get to it. Think about biology. Think about how normal biological systems age. What we really want to get to is kind of are firms like people or not. talk about firm aging. We're using the word aging, but it's really appropriate to use the word age when you think about almost everything we think about aging is like, you know, how old is your dog, how old is your grandma, right? So for all biological things, we think that, you know, there's, you know, once you make it through certain, you know, maybe high risk periods like, you know, childbirth and then the early childhood disease or something, you know, there's kind of a low probability of you know, of failure of your body. But then the failure rate of your body is going to increase as you age. And you can then put other risk factors on there, like, you know, you drive without a seatbelt or whatever it is, right? And so you can basically but over time, you know, you're going to basically face larger and larger risk of failure of, you know, of, say, of your body. Now, it could also be the case that you know, maybe you've heard this too. That my brother's a medical doctor, and he would say things like, sometimes say like, you know, well, he recently operated, he's a surgeon. He worked on a patient who had, you know, didn't have very, they were very thin and frail. They didn't have much body mass to kind of get them through the surgery, and it was very hard to keep the patient, you know, alive or something. The point is that you can have it may be that in case that size can help a firm survive. So it may, you know, say a big firm is going to go through a crisis versus a small firm goes through a fluctuation can wipe out a small firm where it might not wipe out a big firm. So I will come back to that in a minute. Okay, so this is a kind of typical size conditional on age. Now I'm going to do the opposite and say, what is typical age conditional on size? And what you get here now looks quite different. Now we're linear here and log here, but size is always logs. And now what you get basically is that you know, but it kind of rises and plateaus, right? Kind of gently plateaus. So basically, as firms get bigger and bigger, kind of the typical age is not monotonically going up. Right? This is a little bit of a surprise to people. When people see this for the first time, and you think that, well, isn't it the case that all the big firms in America are the oldest firms? In that case, you'd really think that, you know, as size goes up, then you'd have, you know, you'd keep going up like this. But, you know, I think of it once again, maybe not a little, to give David Birch his due. I mean, it's going to be the case that you know, a lot of the older firms have shed workers, so they're not necessarily going to be the biggest firms. And make long story short is what you have here is in essence a richer story about things like what is the relation between age and size. And the reason I'm just going to assert now that the reason why this matters is because there are many economic models, it turns out, where you would get things like you would say, well, you know, you would have a linear relation here, and it would not bend down like this. Now the trouble with having a linear relation is that you're going to get this kind of thing where you can really have very large, very old firms. And when you look at the data, what you see is that a lot of the oldest firms are not large. A lot of the largest firms are not that old. And I didn't put that slide deck in here, but the slide in this deck. But we do have a slide in the book about things like, you know, it turns out if you look at like the Fortune 100, a good number of those firms, like 35 of those firms, are actually very young. Things like, you know, Home Depot had like 10 employees in 1970. Walmart dates from 1960 era. Microsoft, of course, in 1980 had 2 employees, famously, right? Apple, a bunch of those, Intel, a bunch of those firms have really, they kind of grown recently. They're today some of the largest firms in America. Okay, one thing we can do, I'm going to show in time, I'm going to start going faster here, is to say, okay, so we're talking about ages. What is the oldest firm in the economy? Now, I just told you that you know, the oldest firm is not necessarily the biggest firm. Okay, so oldest firm in the economy. And so it turns out one thing you can do, you can say, well, if in fact things are WEIBULL distributed, we can use a stat technique called the order statistics, and ask, you know, what is the likely, if we really have a WEIBULL distribution with certain parameters, what's the probability of finding a firm of, say, size 300, of age 300, or a firm of age, you know, 1,000? It's possible to have a firm of age 2,000. Some of you may know there is a book in the business, it makes the rounds of the business school world called, I think it's called, and I'm going to forget that. There are 2 versions of the book, and I won't say it right, I'm not going to say it, but the author is Ari DeGoose, and his book is about the longest life firms in the world. And there are a couple, there's a Swedish firm that today I believe is a logging company that was basically went from logging into metallurgy, now back to logging or something. That's about 800 years old. There are a couple of Japanese firms that are over 1,000 years old. And in fact, it turns out that in a weird kind of fluke of circumstance, one of them just went bankrupt last year. So maybe by IDing them, you kind of jinxed them. I don't know. And then there are a couple other kind of, you know, curious, odd things that have lived for a long time. Now, of course, obviously, the U.S. has not been populated by, you know, business firms for such a long period of time, so it can't be that long. So what I'm going to show you next is,
There's probably some candle making company. in
you
New England
got a good
that's
intuition, Doug. I'm going to show you.
About 10 people and it's been there for 300 years.
This is the order statistic you would get for what is the largest firm in a WEIBULL distributed population when you have parameters P and Q for the WEIBULL, age A, and the N refers to how many firms are there. Basically, think about every firm is a sample, right? I've drawn more and more samples. Now, of course, I don't really know what N to use, so we talk about the firms over the whole history of America. So this is N for 6 million. So this is if you only consider current firms, which that's the wrong N. And this is an upper bound on how many firms there could ever have been is 100 million. There has to be somewhere between 6 million and 100 million. So these are the two things. But notice that if in fact you use the lower estimate, the oldest firm in America should be about 300 years. So it should go back to about 17, 1715 or something. 1700 we'll say. If in fact you go here, then the oldest firm should go back to not quite 400 years, but no, something like that. Okay, 400 years would be 1617.
1717. Right.
1717, 1617.
Yeah, okay,
Right.
yeah.
Right? Hey, so everybody want to, so Doug is guessing, I'll put words in his mouth. Doug is guessing a New England candle maker. Okay, anybody else want to?
Silversmith.
That's a good one. I thought you were going to say pub, Andrew. Or tavern called it.
A bank.
That's a good choice.
I would bet against the bank.
Those are all good choices. Here's a list of the oldest firms in America. A plantation, which has this debate about when you should actually date it starting. These have all been in continuous operation
Since
since
Silversmith.
from those dates forward. And now, continuous operation in this context means roughly. Recently, they've been filing tax returns under the same number, but many of these obviously have a lot of turnover, and some of them are family. Even say a family, the word family, Barker or Emery. So presumably, the actual taxpayer is changing, right? But yeah, but we have, you have a newspaper. Look at the Hartford Courant.
Funeral home.
Always need those.
So, but the main thing to say is that do we go back to 1750? Easily go back to 17, and you can start about, so it's somewhere in the middle there, right? So the oldest firm in America. It's a little bit.
You do always need those, but children of undertakers tend not to want to be in the same business. It's rather unpleasant work.
All right. So what we're going to do next is the following. We're going to say, so we've done everything so far by fitting that WEIBULL, and now it turns out that it ends up being the following. The following is true: is that if in fact you have I'll do the simple case first. If you have an exponential distribution of ages, you also get an exponential distribution of lifetimes, because there's a constant chance of going out of business. And so remember, lifetimes are really going to be, if you have the age distribution, the change in how many firms there are in each one of at least if that thing is stationary. If ages are stationary, then the change in how many firms there are of a certain age is going to represent how many went out of business in that year. So it turns out that, unfortunately, a WEIBULL distribution of firm ages does not imply a WEIBULL distribution of firm lifetimes. It's something much more complicated. So I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you the results of that calculation, but I don't have a closed form for it. It's a mathematical. It's a
Well, you've got
computation.
some serious truncation of firm ages in this country because nothing goes back more than, what, about 350 years. Yeah.
So what I want to show you next is I'm going to show you now here's how kind of a biostatistician would approach it. They would say, okay, we're forced to deal with these censoring issues. Let's not assume any functional form at all. Okay, and so the conventional way to deal with this is called the Kaplan-Meier estimate. Now, what Kaplan-Meier is that these are going to be age again here. Now this is going to be a cumulative distribution function, the complement of that. Okay, so we're going to basically looking at these are now firms that are this is the cumulative. So how many firms there are, how they're going out of, or how many have survived every period. Now we have this business down here. This is mostly just due to the fact that we have these different ending. First thing to say, I've superimposed all the data here, all the data we have, and so you get these. The steps are a little bit of coloration there, but basically one thing, this is relatively stationary, except for you have different censoring times here at the end. Now with the Kaplan-Meier thing, we can do things that are this is non-parametric. We're not going to force there to be a functional form on this. Okay, and so with this we can do things like we can compute then. Right, we basically from the survival function you also get a lifetime distribution, and you then further get a hazard function. What's the probability of failure? and a couple other ancillary things.
Those step sizes shouldn't look like that unless the data past 5 years out are being rounded to the nearest 5.
Yeah, and so we know we have here, Doug. So in this case, in particular case, we're using the conventional data which census gives us, which is individual years for a long time, and then for some reason they actually start binning stuff.
Yep.
And the bins, so the bins make it more complicated. Okay, but so what I want, I'm going to jump ahead now and kind of show. I'm going to kind of just finish up the next 5 minutes and say that. So what we can do though, with all the data I've shown you, we can really, we do face these censoring and truncation issues, primarily censoring issues. And the Kaplan-Meier estimator is designed to deal with censoring in some meaningful way, but we're interested in looking out, past here, what's going on out here. So what we want to show you next is a plot where simultaneously we're going to put all the things I just mentioned: ages, which you've already seen; lifetimes, which you're seeing, which you can imagine you can get from this. Survival. Because this is survival. If 1 minus this would be failure, right? So the firms that have failed would be monotone increasing like that. Failure rates, and then let's see. Well, I guess I'll just show it. So I'm going to show you basically it's kind of like kernel smoothed version of the non-parametric thing, but I'm going to kind of extrapolate it out, using the kind of conventional methodology to get this. Now, there's 3 colors here. It's a new plot line. Let me just give my note where I want to make sure I get the colors right. I'm not positive I do it from memory. Okay, so the black line. Now notice we're out to age 100 here, and notice we're in log coordinates. Okay, and you say, why are you doing that? Because I think mostly it's in semi-log. Why are you doing log? I'm gonna basically argue that we have another power law now that's new and just discovered. Okay, so that's basically the thrust of it. Okay, so first of all, the black line is in fact the age distribution that we would expect that basically the estimation process reveals to us. So notice that it has this, in this doubly log thing, it has this bend in it, so it's not a pure power law. We saw the ages are basically exponential, but now notice we really only had data out to here, and this is now the result of how the estimator guesses the censoring has kicked in. Now, so that's the black line. Then lifetimes implied then by the black line, the lifetimes are red. Okay. Now once again, it's not a perfect. It's not really a straight line in there, but it has some curvature to it. But the main thing is we can really get. I said that the fact that you have WEIBULL-like ages do not imply WEIBULL-like lifetimes. You see the fact that the curves intersect. So but the main thing to say is that right. So these are this lifetimes, right? There's some chance of having these old firms, even though it's a small chance. Okay, so then the green line is the survival function. So that's what I just showed you in Kaplan-Meier terms, the stepped estimator. This is the kernel smooth version of that. Okay, so we're seeing survival, cumulative. It has curvature in log coordinates. But this is all to get to the blue line, and the blue line basically is the so-called hazard function, or basically the failure probability. Okay. Now I'm going to argue that this is the key finding. First of all, in these log coordinates, the hazard function is basically linear. So we have a power law hazard function, which turns out actually is what you would expect more or less from a WEIBULL distribution. But the main thing to say is that notice it's a power law and it's declining. So now I want you to think about aging. So basically, what the hazard function is, it's actually, because we had discrete data here, it's technically a hazard probability. This is basically what is the you should read the probabilities just off the chart here. This is the probability that a firm of this age will fail this period. Okay, so look at that blue line. So if you have, say, something like 0.2, 20% chance of failing when you're young, when you're brand new. You've been around. You're born at time 0. You can't fail at time 0. You're born at time 0. What's the probability you're going to fail at time 1? It's about 20% or 15%, say. And then as you get older, your failure rate falls dramatically. Now it's falling in exponential coordinates here, right? So now you're down to something like 0.3, or sorry, 0.03. You're going from 15% failure rate down to 3% failure rate. Now, I'm going to argue that this is a very weird kind of aging. So I'm gonna give an analogy. So so imagine that I'm sitting next to my father, me, and then my son. Okay. Now don't ask who has what the lifetimes of the three of us are. The point is we were born at three different times. My son is younger than me. My father's older than me. When you have this kind of hazard function, what it really means is that going forward, which one of us will live the most years from now on? And the answer, the weird thing is that my father will live much longer than me. Has more remaining lifetime than me. And my son has the shortest remaining lifetime. That's a very weird thing to think about. This is essentially this is very non-biological aging. So technically, the way we would say this is you could say we talked earlier about what is the expected lifetime of a firm. It's around say on the order of 15 years. But now what we can say is what's the expected lifetime of a firm conditional on the fact that you've reached age 10 or age 50. And what I've basically argued with this example is the fact that my father has reached age 75 gives him a much lower failure rate going forward than me, who I've reached age 50, and then my son, who's only reached age 15. All right, we got that basic idea?
Yeah, he's learned how to live.
I've heard the usage of programming languages follows something like that pattern.
Yeah. The use of the programming language. Okay.
Like if it's been in common use for a certain number of years, you can expect
Has
it
more
to be in
users.
common use
Okay.
for that number of years again.
Okay.
C isn't going anywhere.
Okay.
That's actually interesting, Rob, because that's like an embeddedness effect in networks. Networks that take on a highly central position are more likely to remain in that position while the periphery of the network continues
Dances around and
changing.
changes.
They have more to lose,
The core
and they're
is
more
robust.
integral. Exactly. So I think when you look at eccentricity in a network to determine the kind of level of embeddedness of a node. So that model would actually fit this quite well, because presumably even if the the firm is not necessarily large, but it's aged well, it's at a central position in some cluster of the network, such that it's integral to the function.
And let me just say, it is a case that in our book we have a whole chapter about firm networks. We go into a little bit of detail, not much, but I'd say it is a case that there are three or four networks certainly matter for firms. Seems like there is a buyer-supplier network that matters. There's also the one that Omar worked on was the labor flow network. How do people flow between firms? And there's other things like things like there's networks of boards of directors, that kind of stuff. And let me just mention that some of you may have heard me say this in yet before, but so during the financial crisis, when the auto companies asked to be bailed out by the government, there was one afternoon in like September, October of 2008 when you had the CEO of GM, Ford, and Chrysler all there testifying, saying why the ballot was important to keep the auto industry afloat. And I mean, reporting this, it's well documented. The GM CEO says, please bail us out because we need the money to be bailed out. Without the ballot money, we're going to go under. And the Chrysler CEO said the same thing. And then the Ford CEO says, we don't actually need the ballot money. We don't want any ballot money. We're solid. We're gonna stay in business. But you better ballot those guys, because if you don't ballot those guys, all the suppliers will go under. And so the network gets destabilized. The network of suppliers is destabilized. And so so Ford needed that network to be propped up in essence by keeping the rest of it in business. Okay. So the technical way to say this is to make this point is say let's actually compute what is the expected remaining lifetime of American business firms as a function of how old they are. Okay, and here's what you get. So basically, when a firm is born, it has an expected lifetime of 15 years, approximately. But as it gets older, as it reaches age 20, now it has an expected lifetime of 20 more years, and by the time you hit age 50 up to 30, now it's not exponentially going crazy, but it's got plateauing here. But you get to 100, you're probably going to live to be 130, 30 something. Okay, so just qualitatively, obviously, it's a very strange form of aging. It turns out, I think in the OR world, this would be called like there are going to be certain kinds of machines that have the property that basically their failure rate declines. They kind of get up and running. They're not going to. Then their failure rate declines over time. So there is kind of a formal mathematics for this whole thing.
That tends to be the machines that don't wear out.
Where they get regular maintenance somehow.
Human bodies do.
Exactly. Human bodies definitely. This is not the human body is going to go the opposite way, right?
Human body follows that phenomenon for a while. The longer you've lived, the better your chances of outliving certain kinds of causes of death. However, one of the things we're finding is more diseases we eliminate that are serious causes causes of mortality, the less we're adding to human life because something else is waiting to step in and get you.
waiting behind the
You have to
curtain.
die of something.
Yeah, exactly.
So that also,
Firms do not have probability one of dying at some point.
Right.
Humans do.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, it goes back to kind of Taleb's concept of anti-fragility and, and so he will claim that the human body is actually an anti-fragile system because once it receives harm, it
adjusts,
most of the time
adapts,
it
right.
adjusts and becomes stronger.
Yeah.
But this is really the true. But eventually the body dies. It has to. Does that?
yeah, it's an interesting way to think about it, Joe. I think, but now, I must say, it is a corollary though of this. But it is the case that even though we looked at some very long life firms, it's also the case that there still is, even for these long life firms. And I'll go back to the previous plot. There's what that power law is telling us. Even a long life firm still has a 3 or 4% chance of failing this year. And so those very longest life firms, they just keep dodging that somehow, right? And there's always some small number. Now, but in a finite sample of only 6 million firms, and you face even this 3% failure rate, eventually there are no old firms left. Right?
Yeah.
So by the way, I gave this talk recently in Silicon Valley, and some of the people out there are not used to thinking about their firms as having only finite life, right? They think that they're going to be around forever. So.
I mean, similarly, if we managed to abolish biological aging, sooner or later everyone would get hit by a bus or something.
Fair enough.
Or each other.
Lightning
Yeah,
or something.
yeah.
Like that.
Rare deaths would be pianos falling on you.
Many of the people in Silicon Valley don't think they're mortal either.
That's true. That's true.
And the
Or at
ones
least
that
Plan
I-
on having their brains frozen.
Okay, so we'll finish up here and just say that
very successful at age 33, and they don't see any hazards down the road.
as many of you know, the Supreme Court, for on the order of 100 years, has really treated corporations as if they have certain legal rights like people, free
They are.
speech rights, et cetera, et
That's the
cetera.
rule.
I mean, the question as to whether the corporate directors have that, who actually, right, who bodies those rights, and what this result really says, corporations are not at all like people, but the whole process of kind of aging and development is really very different, and probably it's a wickedly crude kind of, it's almost like not even zeroth order analogy to say that a corporation is like a person, because even to first order approximation now we have something that's very different. And in particular, you have this strange thing, right? That in essence, you think about this. There really is it's meaningful to talk about. Joe has mentioned it for networks, but it's meaningful to talk about things like there are entrenched entities, institutions. That basically the mere fact that they are old and entrenched means that they will be around in the next period as old and entrenched also, right? And so that's very unlike the normal turnover in biological populations. So maybe even speaks to even things like state law. Should there be taxes on high tax rates on a state law? That kind. I guess the main point to say is that there is a very quantitative sense in which firms are very much unlike people. Now, having said that, I'll say that our report, there is in fact a body of literature in the business school world, or in the org sci world, but Doug, you probably know this guy, for all those guys who worked on the organizational ecology stuff. So those guys really tried to use human-like aging models for corporations, for organizations, and they had only kind of crude data.
Works some for corporate executives, but not for corporations.
Yeah, or I think in their case they had some data on things like certain like the newspaper industry or some tires or something, right? They had some sector. But when you look at the population of firms as a whole, you get a very different answer, and that's the point. Final thing to say, I end by saying it, because you guys all know that, right, I mentioned these are all targets for building a UAS model. And the question is, can we only had these data for a relatively shorter amount of time than we had things like growth rates and size and that kind of stuff. So the question is, can we hit this? And so every time we get new data, you have to screw around the model to kind of figure out how to make it work better. So what I'm going to show you next is a slightly different representation of the same data. Instead of looking at survival rates, instead of looking at failure rates, let's now look at the survival probabilities. And so what you're seeing here is each one of the color lines are again data. But now you can really directly say, well, what's the chance of surviving if you were born at size 0, what's the chance you survive to size 1? Well, it's about 80% chance of survival. But that rises to about 95% as you get older, okay? Now, and what the dots refer to, the dots are how we've gotten our model to come out pretty close to the data. The main thing is, even though we're kind of, we're off by a fair amount here, it should be 79%, we have 83%, 87%, we're off by 10%, a big chunk here. It does have the qualitative picture right. And you know, in essence, the way our model works is that individuals decide to go out and form firms, and what can happen early on in that decision process, they can say, holy cow, I formed this firm, I'm not doing that well, I can find something else better to do, and then they go out and they say, if I find someone else to work with, they can do better that way. So we do get this basically higher failure rate for the young firms than the old firms. So this is basically for the default calibration model, the base case calibration of our big model, the 120 million agent model. Everybody always complains that my machine over there is whirring on all the time. This is the base case calibration. I would like to figure out a way to kind of get that down farther, but as of right now, we don't have that parameterization. So, yes, sir.
Well, one way to do it, and certainly this is a major modeling effort well beyond the scope of this conversation, but it's a thought. The way in which firms do kind of resemble humans is that, like natural organisms, they adapt to the environment they're in. Every once in a while, there's a big change in the environment. Those who manage to survive that change have developed some immunity against a subsequent attack of the same sort of thing, whether it's a disease or a change in the market, a change in the industry.
There's experience of
some of these big changes, though, are fatal. If you're in the vacuum tube business, you can be the best firm there, very well established, doing everything right. Transistors come along. If you didn't see that coming and get into the transistor business first, goodbye, Charlie.
Yeah. Or maybe a different way to say your point is that many of us had grandparents, at least many of us of Doug and my age, had grandparents who had made it through the Depression. And that really seemed to have, not wrong with it, scarred them, but it gave them certain modalities of behavior that were not necessarily the ones that the grandkids had.
Right, yeah.
Yes.
My question was the explanation you gave on the aging of firms.
Yeah.
How would you, what are there like categories that the firms that live longer kind of like check that causes them to be able to live longer than that and expect to live longer than?
I guess that's where I think that if someone was to do what the equivalent is of kind of corporate ethnographies, you could probably get that. And maybe some people who do org theory would have case studies of that kind of stuff. They would know how does the firm fill a niche and how do they survive. At the level of all of our data are really just derived from tax forms, tax filings, which are very crude, where they're just showing the in essence the financials of firms. So we don't have an explanation for that goes deeper than what I've shown here, which we should have. Now it is the case in our model. We say in our model we're getting something like that maybe for a different reason. But the main thing to say is that one thing I'm not going into here. There's a little bit more to say. There's a little more in this book chapter about things like you can say now let's actually now condition the survival probability also on size. And so it turns out that you actually can for a firm that's both old and large, you can actually get it. There are not many of them, but if you are old and large, then you can get this survival probability up to like 99%. So maybe one way to answer your question is just say that size is in fact also something which attenuates the value probability.
I was about to ask if you interacted this with
exactly.
size, because my intuition is small firms would probably often be able to adapt, and large firms, but there would be this point in the middle.
That's interesting, Jen. Yeah, that's
or
right.
at least that strikes me as plausible. I'm
Yeah,
not saying I
right.
know that, but
So what we have done is we did do basically now. I showed you the hazard function as a function of age. Then we did a hazard function as a function of age and size. A little harder to show, but we have there's a 3D plot in the chapter which shows that. So, but your hypothesis is interesting. I don't think we see that in the data. So, right. So you're saying that the small firm is more agile. The big firm has the.
I mean, it could be by the time you show up in the data, you're past that state where you're that agile.
Could be.
Could be. So, yeah, but it's just
Or that fragile.
Yeah.
Because some of those categories might actually be in parallel with biological system.
Possible. That's right. Yeah. Right. Exactly. You can write it.
Life experience.
Elephant can take an attack from a predator which loses 10 pounds of flesh, but none of us could lose 10 pounds of flesh and survive, or something like that. So it's Now it is the case that, if there's anyone from Santa Fe watching, so it is the case that, Jeff West has the new book out about scaling, and he does have this section in there about the fact that, in their data, once again, the publicly traded data, they get the fact that there's an exponential distribution of firm ages, which implies an exponential distribution of lifetimes, which implies that the hazard rate is constant. Which then implies that firms are like people. Which implies that firms are more like people than our firms are. Our firm, humans would have an increasing hazard rate. Exponential was flat hazard rate, and now we're showing that from the data on all firms, you get this
As a declining.
declining.
Right. So from a policy implication then, so let's say we can go back and to the financial crisis, and the CEOs just came into the room and said, rescue us because we're America's biggest firms, and if you don't, you'll have 10 million people unemployed overnight.
Yeah.
Would you then, since you're in the room, or you're the Treasury Secretary, right? And would you then say, actually, no, I'm not going to rescue the largest firms. I'm going to sample the oldest firms, and I'm going to rescue a random sample that came out of my oldest firm.
And of course, the great case study, which we all lived the natural experiment, was Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers are two of the oldest, most well-worn firms on the planet, right?
Yep.
And one of them had no effect at all, hardly, on the economy, and one of them basically caused, ostensibly, was a spark that led to a gigantic, fire, right? So it's hard to know.
Back
right?
to the network effects.
Yeah, exactly. But and so all the counterparties matter and that kind of stuff. And of course, it'd be nice to have the data on how these firms are integrated in the economy, and which ones are going to cause the brush fire, which ones are going to cause a massive forest fire, which ones are not. So So this is the conference we had last week. I was reporting on that at Treasury at this Office of Financial Research. They are trying to glean all the counterparty information to know, are there some firms that are so central that if in fact they were to get in trouble, you definitely have to bail them out, otherwise risk some larger event. Or are there firms that are just they're peripheral and it wouldn't matter. Or is there a way to build a firewall, basically?
So you haven't been so far in your thinking, you haven't jumped yet to the conclusion that perhaps the older firms have survived, or there's a decreasing hazard function because they're so integral to the functioning of the economy, and therefore continue to increase the probability of survival?
So that's certainly a plausible hypothesis. We just don't have data to adjudicate the question.
Okay,
Well,
so you're not there yet.
There's more than integral to the functioning of the economy. Big old firms have tremendous lobbying capability.
So they can modify the rules to suit
They get
themselves.
some political support for their survival.
I don't know, all these firms that you showed earlier don't seem like they have a lot of lobbying capability. They're mostly
there was
like
JP
farmers.
Morgan
Yeah,
is
JP.
in there.
Yeah.
Well, let me mention this following. So
I don't think they lobby.
But it's old
Of
and
course.
large that has lobbying capability.
Old and large,
Owned.
yes,
Yeah.
but also large. I mean, Google has lobbying capability,
Yeah.
right? And how will
So I think
they-
the short answer is there's how much more work to do on that. If anybody wants to work on that for a dissertation, there's what good openings to work on that stuff. I will just mention a couple things about that and say that it does. For example, it turns out that these data, which we have sizes by employees, sizes by receipts. From that, it's a next step because we have financials about things like depreciation, etc. The next logical step is to do things like earnings, profits.
Yeah.
And then you can start getting into things like taxes paid. Okay, now it turns out that we don't want to. There are rules about what you can say about taxes paid when you're working with microdata. So I'm not going to say much about that at all, except to say that from the published information that we have about this, what you find out is that it's interesting that many of the firms that have many certain classes of firms with gigantic tax breaks in America are actually not necessarily super large firms, but there's certain classes of we could call them maybe kind of up and coming firms, or maybe even firms that are kind of mature and powerful, right? And I just report the gross numbers kind of this is now social science to one significant figure. So if in fact there's $30 trillion of private sector output in the U.S. economy. So that's the sum total of all firm output is $30 trillion annually. The total amount of profits are on the order of a couple $1 trillion. Okay, so all profits reported by American firms are a couple $1 trillion. Okay, now if we have a 35% tax rate, which that's what we know, U.S. what's on TV these days, U.S. has the highest corporate tax in the world 35%. So at $2 trillion of earnings, with 35% tax rate, you should have $700 billion of tax revenue. And I was going to tell you, you don't anywhere near that. And so here's the first thing: a bunch of certain kinds of firms, not necessarily big or old, but large. Well, many of them are venerable. Have tax breaks like so-called pass-throughs. So what pass-throughs are things like, for example, hedge funds will say, well, we made a whole bunch of profit, but we're going to be reinvesting that just next period. We're going to keep reinvesting that, so you can't tax it. Or real estate companies will say things like, yes, we just sold this giant building, but we're going to build another building tomorrow, so you can't tax what we just sold.
Oil depletion allowance,
Another
tax
one.
break.
So it turns out of the $2 trillion in kind of gross earnings, only $1 trillion ends up being reported to the tax man. Okay, because the rest it's shielded block, pass-throughs, etc. Now, you say, well, then that means that it should be $350 billion of corporate tax revenue. No, it's still not right. Because now, because of many firms, right, you guys know that when firms have a loss in 1 year, they pay no taxes that year, and then they can actually take the residual loss and move them forward to another year to reduce the profits in the subsequent year.
Individuals can do loss carry forward.
Individuals can do that too,
also.
right? So it turns out,
Rarely have occasion to do it, but it is.
To make a long story short, the total corporate tax revenue in America in a recent year, like in specifics, is on the order of $200 and some billion. So it's at most, from that $1 trillion of profit, it's at most on the order of 22% right now. And the proposal as of yesterday was we want to reduce the level from 35 to 25. But it's effectively only 22 right now, so that's a little bit funny. Right? So anyway, there's a bunch of stuff to be said about that. You have to be careful about how much we say because once again, when you work with microdata, so I was only reporting numbers that are summarized across things. The final thing to say though is that, which is maybe perhaps it will sort your intuition a little bit further, is that when you're looking at who's paying the taxes, I mentioned these hedge funds and real estate guys are not paying. They're typically mid-sized firms. A lot of small firms don't really pay that much in tax either. So it turns out the big multinationals are paying a relatively disproportionate share of the taxes, which is that's relatively well understood. But so what we can do today is we can plot. We can make a kind of power law plot. We can make, say, sizes here and taxes paid here. And turns out that thing is another power law. All right, but with some curious breaks and cutoffs in it. That, we will maybe after all the tax business is done, we can dive in and talk about that sometime. So I'll stop there and thank you very much.